Hi, class. It's Dr. Lindner. Let's take a look at some of these endocrine glands, and we'll talk about some of their hormones and some of the abbreviations to these to the hormones are also important to know. And the reason being is oftentimes during blood chemistry, during blood work, when we're looking at labs, oftentimes we will just see something like under the pituitary, it may just say TSH levels. It may not tell you it's thyroid stimulating hormone. Or we may look at hypothalamic function and ADH. It may not actually say on the lab test anti-diuretic hormone. Okay, so it's important to know the abbreviations as well as what they stand for. So if we look in the brain up in here, we'll see that we have the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and the pineal gland. So these three are up here in the brain. And we're going to focus quite a bit on the H and the P, the hypothalamic pituitary, and let's call this number 4, the thyroid. I do have a video that talks about the HPT axis, which is these three, and then I talk about the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. And these kind of work hand in hand because the hypothalamus itself is always sending some sort of messenger to the pituitary, and then the pituitary will send a messenger to the thyroid. Okay. Or the hypothalamus sends a message to the pituitary, and then the pituitary sends a message to the adrenal, right? So it's just one message, sends another messenger, sends another message. Okay. So the hypothalamus is responsible for releasing regulatory hormones. So these regulatory hormones can be um, releasing hormones or inhibiting hormones. For example, it could release thyroid releasing hormone, or it could release thyroid inhibitory hormone, right? It's a regulator. It's either going to release a thyroid releasing hormone or a thyroid inhibiting hormone. Again, nothing other than an on switch and an off switch. If the hypothalamus was sending thyroid releasing hormone, well, this thyroid releasing hormone would go to the pituitary. And let's say the pituitary has a receptor that looks like this. And then thyroid releasing hormone would go and fit right in here like a lock and key. And when thyroid releasing hormone hits the pituitary, well, it can signal the pituitary to release thyroid stimulating hormone, right? TSH. And then this TSH can come around like this, and it's going to look for the thyroid gland. And the thyroid gland may have a receptor that looks like this. So this is going to come here and fit right inside there. Again, another lock and key, a perfect fit. So thyroid stimulating hormone now hits the thyroid gland, hits its target cell, hits that receptor, and it's going to say, okay, now you're going to release T4, which can be converted to T3, and that's going to start to regulate your metabolism. You've heard of people that have hyperactive thyroids or hypoactive thyroid, right? Their metabolism is working too fast or too slow. The person that just looks at ice cream and looks at a piece of cake and gains weight, or the person that can eat everything under the sun and never gain a pound. right? We know of these people based on their metabolism. Is it working too quick or is it working too slow? So this is just really one um, axis, the HPT axis, the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis. All right, the thyroid gland just doesn't produce T3 and T4 by itself. It has to get messengers from other places. Okay. Okay, let's take a look at what else the hypothalamus releases besides the regulatory hormones. It produces ADH, antidiuretic hormone, and it releases oxytocin. Now, the ADH and oxytocin that it produces, it actually stores it here in the pituitary, and the pituitary has two lobes. It has an anterior lobe and it has a posterior lobe. The posterior lobe, you could see oxytocin and ADH. So the ADH and oxytocin that was produced in the hypothalamus is being stored in the pituitary. It's going to hang out in the posterior lobe, and the posterior lobe of the pituitary will release it on demand when it needs to. Anti-diuretic hormone, if you think of diuretic or diuresis, a diuretic makes you go to the bathroom, makes you pee. An anti-diuretic is against losing water. It's against peeing. Okay? So think of coffee and alcohol. Those are diuretics. An anti-diuretic doesn't allow you to hold on to fluid. Oxytocin can affect both male and female reproductive tract. In the female, it's going to make the woman's uterus contract. So when we do the reproductive organs and we look at the woman's uterus, there's an inner part called an endometrium, a middle part called a myometrium, and then an outer part called the perimetrium. The myometrium, myo means muscle, the myometrium is going to, which is smooth muscle, can go through contractions, and it's only creating contractions solely based on the release of oxytocin. Okay. Oxytocin can affect male as well in terms of ejaculation. All right, so the posterior lobe releases the oxytocin and ADH that the hypothalamus produced. The anterior lobe has one, two, three, four, five, six. We got seven of them. And you don't have to write these out because I think on the next slide or two slides up, it actually tells you what these abbreviations are for. So if you don't get it right now, it's okay. There's a key that's coming up. Okay. I think the key is right here on the next slide. You can see it up in this corner here. Okay. So when we talk about ACTH, it stands for adrenocorticotropic hormone. TSH, thyroid stimulating hormone. GH, growth hormone. PRL, prolactin. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. LH, luteinizing hormone. MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. So those are the hormones that we see right here in the anterior lobe. Okay. Uh, the thyroid, we said the thyroid produces T4 and T3 and calcitonin. Now, T4 gets converted into T3. Most of that takes place in the liver, and it is selenium dependent, meaning it needs that mineral selenium. Some of the conversion takes place in the thyroid, but the majority of the T3 that's produced is actually done by the liver, and it's selenium dependent. So a lot of people that have thyroid issues never really consider, well, maybe the liver needs a little bit of support. Maybe the liver is being a little bit challenged and it needs some detoxification to function better so the thyroid works better. So T4, the T is for tyrosine. It's an amino acid. And then the 3 and the 4 is for how many iodines attach to tyrosine. So if you have 4 iodides that attach, it's T4. If you have 3 iodides that attach, it's T3. So T4 is known as thyroxine, and T3 is triiodo, like iodine, triiodothyronine. Okay, so these T4 and T3 are involved with metabolism, and calcitonin may be a new one. You probably have never heard of calcitonin before, but calcitonin is involved in regulating calcium balance in the body. And it does so in conjunction with this here on the right side called the parathyroid gland. The parathyroid gland is making PTH, which is parathyroid hormone. Again, this one is involved in regulating calcium balance. So both the thyroid and the parathyroid are involved in regulating calcium balance because you need some calcium in the body to allow for blood to clot. You need calcium for bone strength. You need calcium for muscle contraction and nerve impulses. So we need some calcium. And it has to be a very, very tight window, something like 9 to 11 milligrams per deciliter, right? It's only 9 to 11. So we need calcitonin and PTH to regulate that tight window. So if there's too much of it, the body has to get rid of some. And if there's too little of it, the body has to reserve some. All right, so we'll talk about these in a separate slide, just laying down some foundational work right now. The pineal gland up here on the top right, the pineal, not to be confused with pituitary, the pineal produces melatonin. Okay, melatonin tones you down, not to be confused with melanin. This is different. Melanin is involved with skin pigmentation. Mela, black substance. Melanin is skin pigmentation. Melatonin helps to tone you down at night. It helps you sleep. Melatonin also is very helpful with people with irritable bowel syndrome, IBS. Okay, let's look at the kidneys. We see the kidneys are right here, and just above the kidneys is the adrenals. When you look at the word adrenal, we see add to the renal. Renal is kidney. Adrenal. Sometimes it's also known as the suprarenal gland because supra means above. It is above the kidney. Now, I will go in more detail shortly about the adrenal gland, and I will break down the outer part of the adrenal gland called the cortex and the inner part of the adrenal gland called the adrenal medulla. And I'll go over the hormones that they make. So the adrenal medulla, the inner part, makes epinephrine and norepinephrine, and the outer part makes cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone, aldosterone, right? So you're going to hear me talk about the adrenal cortex quite a bit and the adrenal medulla. The pancreas, our good friend, the pancreas, the endocrine portion makes insulin and glucagon. The beta cells make insulin, and the alpha cells produce glucagon. Insulin is designed to lower blood sugar, whereas glucagon is designed to increase blood sugar. Now, those are the main endocrine glands, and we're just going to mention some of these accessory ones. Remember, these are other organs that have secretory cells that do have endocrine function. The heart is part of the cardiovascular system, but it helps to regulate blood pressure by producing atrial natriuretic peptide. And when we look at the word atrial natriuretic peptide, look at the word natriuretic. It sounds like diuretic. But natriuretic, when you look at the first two letters of natriuretic, it's Na, which comes from natrium. And Na is from NaCl, sodium chloride. It's sodium. So when blood pressure is too high, the heart will release ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. It'll try and signal the body to say, hey, if there's any additional salt, let's try and get rid of it so we can lower blood pressure. The thymus is going to secretes thymosins, which is involved with your immune system, and it helps your body make T cells for the immune system. The thymus grows rapidly in the first few years of life, but then as we get older, it goes through atrophy. It starts to deteriorate, which is why the immune systems can get a little bit weaker as we get older. The adipose, which is fat, secretes leptin. It's the leptin that makes you feel full after you eat food that has fat in it. But adipose is also interesting because they release something called cytokines. And cytokines can be very inflammatory. Cytokines are inflammatory messengers. So the more fat cells a person has, the more prone they are to inflammation. Any inflammatory issue or inflammatory disease is always made worse by obesity or more adipose tissue, whether it's osteopenia, osteoporosis, cancer, rheumatoid, MS, any type of inflammatory issue is made worse by fat cells because of those cytokines. The digestive tract also secretes some hormones, especially the duodenum or the duodenum of the small intestine. It produces something called CCK, which stands for cholecystokinin. Cholecystokinin is going to make the gallbladder contract. It's released by the duodenum. So when the stomach right here is filled with food, when fat is in the stomach and it goes right here into the duodenum, this part of the intestine, above right here you'd have the liver, and then there's an extension called the gallbladder. It's this red thing right here. It's the gallbladder. And when fat enters the duodenum releases CCK. CCK is going to go to the gallbladder. It's going to make it contract, and it's going to release the right elements that fat needs to be broken down. So the liver makes bile, but the bile is stored in the gallbladder. And CCK makes the gallbladder contract, squeezes out the bile into the duodenum, and helps to break down the fat. And this is why when we do a physical exam and we ask our patients, when you go to the bathroom, tell me a little bit about your stool. Like, how often do you go? Do they float? Do they sink? What's the color of them? Floaters and sinkers make a big difference, because if they don't sink and they float, it means that there's some liver gallbladder issues going on, because that means you're passing fat through the stool, and fat floats. And when it's broken down properly, you'll get stool that sinks to the bottom as it's supposed to. So that's diagnostic. It usually means that the person needs to be consuming some digestive enzymes as supplementation to help break down the additional fats. Okay, when we look at the kidney is going to release erythropoietin and calcitriol. EPO, erythropoietin, means to produce red blood cells. So as blood is going through the kidneys have these sensors that can kind of evaluate what the oxygen levels are like because red blood cell, a red blood cell has iron, has hemoglobin, and we know that iron and oxygen bind to each other. So as blood is going through the kidneys, if the sensors go, hey, oxygen levels are kind of low, and oxygen is needed for every cell for the mitochondria to produce ATP, since oxygen is low, um, we're going to produce erythropoietin, and EPO is going to go to the bone marrow, and the bone marrow is going to push out more red blood cells. More red blood cells, more hemoglobin, more iron, the more capability of binding to oxygen, which means that the O2 level go up and then their energy levels go up. Calcitriol is vitamin D. So the kidneys are involved in vitamin D production. So is the liver, and so is the skin. In order to make vitamin D, the sun has to hit the skin, right? So you have the sun, and the sun has to come down at a 90-degree angle, hit the subcutaneous cholesterol that sits on the skin. Those subcutaneous cholesterol will find its way to the liver, and then the liver sends the vitamin D precursors to the kidneys, and the kidneys will produce vitamin D. So, in order to make this hormone, vitamin D, we need sunlight, we need healthy skin, we need good cholesterol in our skin, healthy liver, and healthy kidneys. Okay, then we have the gonads. In the male, we have the testes. In the female, we have the ovaries. And the testes are going to be involved in producing testosterone, and the ovaries will produce estrogen. It'll also produce progesterone as well. Okay. So when we look at this connection up here is the H for the hypothalamus. Here is the P, right? Because I called it the HPT axis or the HPA axis, the hypothalamic pituitary thyroid axis, or the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. So up here is the hypothalamus, and it's going to send out those regulatory hormones, and it's going to send them to the pituitary. And the pituitary has two lobes, right? It's got the posterior lobe and it's got the anterior lobe. So in this case, we could see the anterior lobe has adrenocorticotropic hormone, thyroid stimulating hormone, growth hormone. We have prolactin, follicular stimulating hormone, and luteinizing hormone. So those are the ones that we see up here on the right. Now, when the hypothalamus sends a signal to the anterior pituitary, and that hormone is adrenocorticotropic hormone. When we look at the term adreno, is adrenal gland, cortico from cortex. Now, cortex means the bark of a tree. Cortex means the bark of a tree, which is the outer protection to the tree. So adrenocorticotropic hormone, it's going to go to the cortex. We see the adrenal cortex is this outer part, the bark, if you would, of the adrenal gland, whereas the inner part is called the adrenal medulla. So the adrenocorticotropic hormone goes to the outer part, and the outer part is going to make what we call glucocorticoids. Gluco from glucose, corticoids like cortisol, cortisone, corticosterone. Now, That goes from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, anterior pituitary, to the adrenal, and we make these hormones. There's another path that goes directly from the brain down the spinal cord to the adrenal medulla. There's no, right, it bypasses the pituitary. So it goes right from the brain, the hypothalamus, right to the adrenal medulla, where we push out adrenaline and noradrenaline, also known as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Adrenaline is epinephrine, noradrenaline is also norepinephrine. So when you push out cortisol, that's going to get your heart racing, that's going to make your glucose levels high, right? Epinephrine and norepinephrine is make your heart beat quicker. There's just two different um, paths to rev up your system, either the cortex or the adrenal medulla. One reacts to short-term stress, the other is long-term stress, and I'll go over that in a separate video, and I'll explain how stress can kill. Now we have the hypothalamic, pituitary, thyroid axis. So here the anterior pituitary pushes out thyroid stimulating hormone. It hits the receptor on the thyroid gland that pushes out T4, and T4 is converted to T3. Most of it takes place in the liver, and it is selenium dependent. Some of the conversion can take place in the thyroid, it's just not the majority of it. The hypothalamic can send regulatory hormones to the anterior pituitary, pushes out growth hormone. Growth hormone, like it sounds, helps you grow, goes to the liver, makes somatomedins, and it's going to make your bone, your muscles, and your other tissues increase in size and grow. Growth hormone is produced about 50 minutes after you go to sleep. Okay? Now, unless you have refined sugars before bedtime, if you have like a sweet tooth and you eat some sugary snacks before bedtime, you can block the receptors of growth hormone. And then you wake up in the morning just as tired as you did when you went to bed. The hypothalamic sends signals to the anterior pituitary, and the anterior pituitary produces prolactin, prolactation. It goes to the mammary glands for milk production. The anterior pituitary can push out follicular stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. These are both involved in the production of sperm and the production of the egg, and they affect both male and female. The testes predominantly are going to produce testosterone, whereas the ovaries will produce estrogen and progesterone, or it can just inhibit production of anything. Okay. There's also melanocyte stimulating hormone, MSH, melanocyte from mela. So it's involved in skin pigmentation to a certain degree. Then you have the posterior pituitary that we said releases antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin. Oxytocin will affect the smooth muscle of the uterus. This is when the woman feels contractions or cramps during the time of month because it's affecting the myometrium, the muscle. Oxytocin can affect the smooth muscle around the vas deferens or the ductus deferens in male during ejaculation. And ADH, antidiuretic hormone, it's going to allow you to hold on to water, antidiuretic, antidiuresis. So on this slide, it's going to show the hormones and then the principal actions that we have next to it. So growth hormone, it's going to stimulate the liver, muscle, cartilage, bone, and other tissues to synthesize and secrete what's called IGFs, or insulin-like growth factors, which in turn is going to promote growth of body tissues. Growth hormone acts directly on target cells to enhance lipolysis and to decrease glucose uptake. This means to enhance the breakdown of fat and decrease the sugar storage. Thyroid stimulating hormone, it's going to stimulate the synthesis and the secretion of thyroid hormones for your metabolism. FSH in the female, it's going to develop the egg and induces the secretion of estrogen. And in the male, it's going to stimulate the testes to produce sperm. LH, or luteinizing hormone, in the female, it's predominantly involved in ovulation. So when the egg is produced and somewhere around day 14 of a woman's cycle, if it's a 28-day cycle, somewhere at the midpoint, the egg ovulates. And what that means is that the pressure pushes the egg out of the ovary and scoops it up into the fallopian tube. That's when women are trying to plan a pregnancy. They'll take luteinizing hormone dipsticks. They'll dip it in the urine, and you see these commercials where the women are calling their, husbands, you gotta come home, hurry up, hurry up, hurry up. I'm ovulating, I'm ovulating. They only have literally like a 24-hour window to conceive. And if conception doesn't take place in the 24 hours, then a woman has to wait a whole other month to try and conceive. So it could be very frustrating for couples that are trying to plan a pregnancy this way. In males, luteinizing hormone is involved in producing testosterone. So FSH and LH are not just female hormones, they affect the male as well. Prolactation is involved in the production of milk. And we have adrenocorticotropic hormone, ACTH, is going to hit the adrenal cortex to produce mainly cortisol. Okay. And MSH, still a little bit of a mystery, but it's involved in darkening the skin. There is some influence over the brain as well, but still a lot of research going on with that. In terms of oxytocin, it's involved in smooth muscle contraction around the mammary glands and the uterus of women. It's also involved in the vas deferens of the male. And ADH is involved in anti-diuretic, holding on to water. So that's going to affect the kidneys, the skin, and the blood vessels. Conserves body water by decreasing urine volume, decreasing water loss through perspiration, and raises the blood pressure by constricting the arterioles. Good place to take our next break. I know that was a long run. When we come back, we'll talk about positive and negative feedback loops.